Hello, bored people, and welcome to Muted History. Whether you're scrolling through your phone at 2 a.m., procrastinating on homework, or just trying to escape the endless noise of notifications, this is your invitation to slow down. This channel exists for curious minds like yours, the ones still wondering how the stories we tell ourselves became the stories we believe. And if you happen to drift off during this journey, that's perfectly fine. I've added timestamps in the description so you can pick up exactly where you left off, because this story deserves to be heard from beginning to end. This isn't a channel of wild theories or sensational claims. It's a quiet space for patient science, for humble archaeology, for genetics told carefully by someone who doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but is genuinely trying to ask better questions. If you appreciate this kind of storytelling, the kind that makes you think rather than react, I'd be grateful if you'd like and subscribe. It helps others discover content that prioritizes depth over drama, curiosity over certainty. Tonight's story begins with a question that has captivated scientists and the public alike for decades. Can one man's genetic legacy reshape an entire continent? We're diving into the tale of an empire that allegedly changed our very DNA, and the surprising scientific myth that followed. This is the story of Genghis Khan and the genetic empire that may never have existed. So settle in, stay curious, and let's begin. Picture this. You're sitting in a sterile laboratory in the early 2000s, staring at data that doesn't quite make sense. Spread across your computer screen are genetic markers from thousands of men across Asia. And buried in those numbers is a pattern so striking it seems almost impossible. A single Y chromosome lineage appears to be carried by roughly 1 in every 200 men across a massive swath of territory stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea. That's approximately 16 million living men, all apparently descended from the same paternal ancestor. The timing of this lineage's expansion, according to molecular clock estimates, points to roughly 800 years ago. And if you're doing the math, that takes you straight back to the early 13th century, precisely when one particular nomad was building the largest contiguous land empire in human history. This is how one of the most captivating genetic myths of our time was born. Not from bones or tombs or ancient manuscripts, but from spreadsheets and statistical models, and the tantalizing possibility that we might be able to trace the biological echo of conquest itself. But here's where our story takes an unexpected turn. Because as compelling as this narrative sounds, as much as it appeals to our desire for clean historical explanations, the reality is far more complex than anyone initially imagined. We're about to explore how a legitimate scientific observation became a viral legend, and how the search for genetic proof of empire reveals as much about our modern obsessions as it does about medieval history. To understand how we got here, we need to step back into the windswept grasslands of 12th century Mongolia, where a society was taking shape that would fundamentally challenge every assumption about how empires work. This wasn't a world of stone cities or permanent monuments. There were no marble forums or towering temples, no written constitutions carved into tablets. Instead, there was movement. Constant, calculated, purposeful movement. The Mongolian steppes stretched endlessly in every direction, an ocean of grass punctuated by hills and framed by distant mountains. This was not land that granted easy survival. Temperatures could plummet to -40 degrees in winter. Snowstorms could strip pasture bare or freeze entire herds alive. Rain was unreliable, rivers could vanish for years, and the wind was relentless. Yet for over 1,000 years before any Khan rose to power, people had not just survived here, but thrived. They lived in homes that could be folded and packed, structures made of felt and wool, and collapsible wooden frames tied together with rope and generations of knowledge. These were called jairs or yurts, round dwellings that faced south to catch morning light, insulated against brutal winds, and designed with one fundamental principle in mind: they could move. This mobility wasn't just practical, It was existential. The central steppe received between 200 and 400 millimetres of precipitation per year, mostly in summer. Pastures bloomed and withered quickly. Stay too long in one place, and your animals starved. Leave too early, and you might arrive at barren ground. So families moved according to invisible calendars passed down through generations, following patterns carved not into stone, but into memory. But it wasn't just about following grass. These people had formed a symbiotic relationship with animals that went far beyond simple domestication. Sheep and goats made up the majority of their herds, providing milk, meat and wool. Yaks and oxen offered transport and strength. Camels carried heavy loads across desert regions. And then there were the horses. To understand the world that would eventually produce Genghis Khan, you must understand that horses weren't luxury items or battlefield assets. They were dimensions of existence itself. A family might own dozens, a clan might manage hundreds. Children learned to ride before they could properly walk, guiding animals with their knees while working a bow or rope. These weren't the large war horses of European cavalry, but compact, hardy animals that could graze under snow, navigate without paths, and tolerate conditions that would kill other breeds. This relationship with mobility shaped everything about steppe society. Leadership was fluid rather than fixed. A chief who failed to deliver good pasture or protection could find his followers simply riding away to join someone more capable. Authority came from charisma, from success in managing herds and people, from the ability to read weather patterns and animal behaviour and the subtle politics of clan relationships. Religion reflected this mobility as well. There were no temples housing permanent gods, no priestly hierarchies demanding fixed tithes. Instead, there was Tengri, the eternal blue sky, a cosmic order that moved with the clouds and spoke through the wind. Shamans served as intermediaries between human and spirit worlds, wearing robes decorated with animal parts, carrying drums that could summon trances or divine the future. But even they travelled, following the rhythm of the herds and the seasons. Trade existed, but modestly. Wool, meat and horses were exchanged for metal tools, grains, and occasional luxuries like tea or silk. Most commerce happened along seasonal routes, often with neighbouring settled societies. But wealth accumulation was limited by the very nature of nomadic life. Without permanent buildings or secure storage, surplus was kept in animals or portable goods. This was the world that shaped the young man who would become Genghis Khan, a world where survival depended not on controlling territory, but on understanding movement, where power came not from building walls, but from knowing when and where to migrate, where success was measured not in monuments, but in the health of herds and the loyalty of followers. But this mobile world was also fragmented and violent. The steppes in the late 12th century were carved up among dozens of competing tribes and clans. Names that survive in later chronicles, like the Karaites, Merkits, Naimans, and Tatars already existed, but their exact boundaries and allegiances shifted constantly. Leadership was hereditary within dominant lineages, but power was always precarious. Winters could destroy entire communities. Raids were common, especially during lean years when one group might steal livestock from another, triggering cycles of vengeance that could last generations. There was no central authority to mediate these conflicts, no shared legal system beyond clan traditions and personal honour codes. The steppes were politically atomized, a patchwork of mobile societies that shared similar lifestyles but maintained fierce independence and often bitter rivalries. Into this fractured world was born a boy sometime between 1155 and 1167, a child whose exact birth date has been lost to the uncertainties of oral tradition and the chaos of his times. We know him by the name history would give him, but he began life as Temujin, son of Yesugei, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan. The Borjigin were not particularly powerful or wealthy. They claimed descent from the mythical Blue Wolf and white doe of Mongol folklore, but such claims were common among steppe nobility. What mattered more was immediate reality, the size of your herds, the strength of your alliances, and your ability to protect your people through the harsh cycles of steppe life. Temujin's childhood was not that of a privileged heir. When he was still young, his father was allegedly poisoned by members of a rival tribe while attending a feast. With Yasuge's death, whatever protection and status the family had enjoyed evaporated. They were abandoned by their allies, stripped of their herds and forced to survive on the margins of steppe society. What followed were years of desperate hardship. Temujin's mother, Hualun, was left to raise her children alone. They lived by fishing, foraging, and trapping small animals for meat. They were outcasts in a world where community membership meant survival. The early life of the future Genghis Khan was not about conquest or glory, but about the daily struggle to avoid starvation. Yet even in this adversity, patterns began to emerge that would later define his approach to power. Rather than accept his family's exile as permanent, Temujin began the slow work of rebuilding connections. He married young, as was customary, to Berta of the Ongirat tribe. This alliance would prove crucial not just personally, but politically. When Berta was later kidnapped by the Merkits, Temujin formed a rescue coalition with his blood brother Jamuka and a powerful leader named Togrul, also known as Wang Khan. This episode reveals something fundamental about Temujin's emerging strategy. He understood that in the fractured world of the steppes, survival and success depended on building networks of mutual obligation. He began to attract followers not through inherited status, but through demonstrated competence and calculated generosity. His camp became a refuge for those disappointed by traditional aristocratic hierarchies: orphans, outcasts, former slaves, and ambitious men from minor families. But alliances on the steppes were fragile, and personal relationships could quickly turn deadly. Jamuka, once Temujin's closest companion, became his most bitter rival as their visions for steppe unity diverged. Where Temujin favoured a merit-based system that promoted loyalty regardless of birth rank, Jamuka aligned with more traditional aristocratic factions. Their friendship fractured into open warfare. The conflict that followed was not a simple clash of armies, but a complex struggle for legitimacy and vision. Temujin was building something new: military units organised in decimal structures of 10, 100, 1,000 and 10,000, with leaders selected for competence rather than lineage. These units served not just military functions but social ones, creating bonds that transcended traditional clan boundaries. This organisational innovation would later become the backbone of Mongol military efficiency, but in these early years, it was primarily a tool for social integration. It allowed Temujin to absorb defeated enemies, promote talented individuals regardless of their origins, and create loyalty structures based on shared success rather than inherited obligation. The process of unification was neither quick nor inevitable. It took Temujin decades to consolidate power across the Mongolian steppes, and the outcome was never certain. He suffered defeats, endured betrayals, and faced coalitions of enemies who recognized the threat his new model of organization represented. But gradually, the balance shifted. His reputation for military competence grew alongside his practice of redistributing captured wealth among his followers. Unlike traditional steppe leaders who hoarded plunder for themselves and their immediate relatives, Temujin shared broadly, creating incentives for continued loyalty and attracting ever more defectors from rival camps. By the early 1200s, he had established himself as the dominant power on the Mongolian plateau. In 1206, a great assembly of tribal leaders gathered near the Onon River to formally recognize his supremacy. He was given the title Genghis Khan, often rendered as Genghis Khan in Western texts. The exact meaning remains debated, but it likely derived from words meaning universal or oceanic, implying vastness beyond measure. This was not merely a political coronation, but a fundamental reorganization of steppe society. The new Khan began codifying laws and customs into what would become known as the yasa, a flexible legal framework that emphasized discipline, loyalty, and merit over traditional aristocratic privilege. He established diplomatic protocols, regulated hunting seasons, and created systems for military organization and communication. Most importantly, he began to articulate a vision that transcended tribal boundaries. The old system of fractured clans and endless feuds was declared obsolete. The steppes would now move with one purpose, under one law, toward objectives that none of the individual tribes could have achieved alone. What Genghis Khan had accomplished by 1206 was extraordinary by any measure. No previous leader had managed to unify so many diverse groups into a stable confederation. Most attempts at steppe unification had collapsed within a generation, undermined by internal rivalries or external pressures. But this new empire had institutional depth. It could function in the Khan's absence, had clear succession procedures, and possessed administrative structures that could adapt to changing circumstances. Yet this was only the beginning. The unified steppes represented enormous potential energy, like a drawn bow waiting to be released. And once that energy began flowing outward, it would reshape the political geography of half the world. But the question that haunts us 8 centuries later is not just what this empire accomplished, but what traces it left behind. Not in chronicles or monuments, which can be destroyed or forgotten, but in the most intimate record of all, the genetic legacy carried forward in human bodies across generations. Did the biological reality match the historical legend? And if so, how can we possibly prove it? This is where our story truly begins, in the gap between what we know and what we can demonstrate, between the myth of genetic empire and the messy reality of medieval DNA. The question of genetic legacy becomes even more complex when you consider what happened next. Because the empire that emerged from those unified steppes didn't just conquer territory, it fundamentally altered the human landscape of Eurasia in ways that are still being untangled by scientists today. By 1220, Mongol armies had swept beyond their traditional boundaries and were carving through kingdoms that had stood for centuries. But this wasn't conquest in the familiar sense of replacing one ruling class with another. This was something more systematic, more transformative. Entire populations were relocated, sometimes voluntarily, often not. Skilled craftsmen were transported thousands of kilometers to build infrastructure in distant regions. Administrative experts were moved between conquered territories to establish new governmental systems. Consider what this meant in biological terms. For the first time in recorded history, a single political entity was facilitating human movement on a continental scale. Chinese engineers found themselves building siege weapons in Central Asia. Persian scholars were appointed to administrative posts in what is now Russia. Merchants from Baghdad could travel to Beijing under the protection of the same legal system and military guarantee. This unprecedented mobility had demographic consequences that went far beyond simple conquest. When populations mix at scale, when barriers that have separated communities for centuries suddenly disappear, genetic patterns shift in measurable ways. Not dramatically, not overnight, but persistently across generations. The Mongol administrative system, known as the Yam, created a network of relay stations stretching across thousands of kilometers. These weren't just postal stops, but nodes of human activity where people from different regions regularly encountered each other. Marriages occurred between groups that had previously been separated by vast distances. Children were born who carried genetic contributions from populations that might never have met without imperial infrastructure to bring them together. But here's where the story becomes more nuanced than simple conquest narratives suggest. The Mongols were remarkably pragmatic about local customs and existing power structures. Rather than imposing a uniform Mongol culture across their territories, they often preserved local traditions while overlaying them with imperial administrative systems. This meant that genetic mixing occurred not through replacement but through integration. Chinese records from the period describe the movement of entire communities, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands, relocated to serve imperial needs. Islamic chronicles mention the establishment of Mongol administrative centres, where local populations worked alongside officials from distant parts of the empire. European accounts describe the arrival of Asian merchants and diplomats in numbers unprecedented in previous centuries. Each of these movements represented potential genetic mixing events, not the dramatic founder effects that early researchers hypothesized, but the steady accumulation of small-scale demographic changes that could, over time, reshape the genetic landscape of entire regions. The empire's approach to religious and cultural diversity also facilitated genetic mixing in unexpected ways. Unlike many conquest states that imposed uniform belief systems, the Mongols practiced what can only be described as strategic tolerance. Buddhist monks, Christian priests, Islamic scholars, and traditional shamans all found places within the imperial system, often working in the same administrative centres. This religious pluralism had practical consequences for human movement and interaction. Mongol courts became cosmopolitan environments where scholars and officials from vastly different backgrounds collaborated on everything from legal codes to astronomical calculations. These weren't just intellectual exchanges, but social environments where personal relationships formed across cultural boundaries. Marriage alliances were a crucial tool of Mongol diplomacy, but they operated at multiple social levels. While the most famous examples involved royal families, similar patterns occurred throughout the administrative hierarchy. Local officials married into Mongol administrative families. Merchants established permanent relationships in distant trading centres. Military officers settled in conquered territories and integrated with local communities. The scale of this integration becomes clearer when you consider the empire's approach to military organisation. Rather than maintaining ethnically pure Mongol units, the imperial army incorporated soldiers from conquered territories into mixed formations. These weren't just auxiliary troops, but integrated combat units, where men from different regions fought alongside each other, shared resources, and often established long-term bonds that extended beyond military service. Archaeological evidence from Mongol period sites across Eurasia reveals this demographic mixing in material terms. Burial practices show combinations of traditions from different regions. Pottery styles blend techniques from distant areas. Tools and weapons incorporate design elements from multiple cultural traditions. These aren't just trade goods, but evidence of communities where people from different backgrounds were living and working together. But perhaps the most significant factor in genetic mixing was the empire's economic system. The Mongol period saw an unprecedented expansion of trade networks. But this commerce wasn't just about luxury goods moving between distant markets. It involved the movement of people. Caravan leaders, translators, craftsmen, and labourers who travelled regularly between regions that had previously had minimal contact. Trading posts evolved into permanent settlements where people from different regions established families. Seasonal markets became annual gatherings that facilitated not just economic exchange, but social interaction. The famous Silk Road reached its medieval peak during this period, but the most important cargo may not have been silk or spices, but the people who carried them. Modern genetic analysis has begun to reveal the biological legacy of this imperial mixing system, though not in the ways that early researchers expected. Rather than finding clear signatures of Mongol conquest, scientists are discovering complex patterns of genetic admixture that reflect the empire's role as a facilitator of human movement rather than a simple conquest machine. Studies of Y chromosome variation across Central Asia show not a single dominant lineage, but multiple overlapping patterns of expansion and mixture. Some of these patterns do correlate with the Mongol period, but they suggest a process more complex than the simple founder effect originally hypothesized. Instead of one man's genetic legacy dominating the region, the data point to multiple episodes of demographic mixing facilitated by imperial infrastructure, autosomal DNA analysis, which examines the full spectrum of genetic inheritance rather than just paternal lineages, reveals even more complexity. Populations across the former Mongol Empire show mosaic patterns of ancestry that include components from East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. These aren't ancient patterns, but relatively recent admixture events that correlate with historical periods of increased connectivity. Perhaps most intriguingly, these genetic mixing patterns don't correlate neatly with political boundaries or conquest timelines. Instead, they follow trade routes, administrative centres, and zones of sustained cultural interaction. This suggests that the empire's genetic legacy came not primarily from conquest, but from the systems of movement and exchange that conquest made possible. The implications of this research extend beyond simple historical curiosity. What we're seeing in the genetic record is evidence of how political systems can reshape human biology not through dramatic replacement events, but through subtle changes in mobility patterns and social organisation. The Mongol Empire created conditions that allowed people to move and mix in ways that had been impossible for centuries. But this raises uncomfortable questions about how we interpret genetic data in historical contexts. The early focus on identifying Genghis Khan's lineage reflected assumptions about how genetic legacy works that may have been fundamentally flawed. Real genetic change happens not through the reproductive success of single individuals, but through systematic changes in population structure and mobility patterns. The search for genetic proof of empire reveals as much about our modern obsessions as it does about medieval history. We want clean narratives that connect biological data to historical figures, but evolution doesn't work that way. Genetic legacy is messy, probabilistic, and often invisible to the methods we use to detect it. What the Mongol example teaches us is that the most profound genetic changes may come not from conquest, but from connection. Not from the imposition of foreign genes, but from the creation of systems that allow previously separated populations to interact and integrate over time. The empire's biological legacy lies not in any single lineage, but in the complex web of relationships it made possible. This brings us to one of the most persistent myths in popular genetics: the idea that we can trace modern genetic patterns back to specific historical individuals. The Genghis Khan gene story captured public imagination precisely because it seemed to offer a direct connection between contemporary DNA and medieval conquest. But as we've seen, the reality is far more complex. The Y chromosome lineage that was initially attributed to Genghis Khan appears in roughly 8% of men across a vast region of Asia. That's approximately 16 million people today who share this particular paternal ancestry. But sharing a Y chromosome lineage doesn't mean sharing a specific ancestor, especially when that lineage could have expanded through multiple related males or through cultural practices that favoured certain family lines over others. Moreover, the molecular clock estimates that were used to date this lineage's expansion have significant margins of error. What seemed like a precise correlation with Genghis Khan's lifetime could equally well point to expansions that occurred before or after his period. The statistical confidence intervals are broad enough to encompass multiple centuries. More recent genetic studies have identified similar patterns of Y chromosome expansion across Eurasia. some clearly unrelated to the Mongol period. These star-shaped phylogenies, where multiple lineages radiate rapidly from a common ancestor, appear to be relatively common in human populations, especially in regions with mobile pastoral societies and practices of elite polygyny. This doesn't mean the Mongol expansion had no genetic consequences. Rather, it suggests that those consequences were more diffuse and complex than early researchers assumed. The empire's biological legacy may lie not in any single dramatic founder effect, but in the systematic changes it created in human mobility and interaction patterns. The search for Genghis Khan's genetic legacy has also revealed the limitations of current genetic methods for historical reconstruction. Without direct biological samples from historical individuals, connecting modern genetic patterns to specific past figures remains largely speculative. Even if we had Genghis Khan's DNA, proving genetic continuity across 800 years and dozens of generations would require a level of precision that current population-level genetic data simply cannot provide. This methodological humility is important because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how genetic data gets interpreted in popular culture. The desire to find famous ancestors in our DNA reflects deep psychological needs for connection and significance, but it can lead us to overinterpret statistical correlations as historical proof. The real story of genetic legacy in the Mongol period is probably less dramatic but more historically accurate than the single founder narrative. It's a story of gradual demographic change, facilitated by political systems that prioritized mobility and integration over ethnic purity. It's a story of how infrastructure and institutions can reshape human biology in ways that are subtle but persistent across generations. And it's a story that reminds us that genetic change happens not through the actions of individual heroes, but through the accumulated choices of thousands of ordinary people responding to changing circumstances and opportunities. The empire changed the genetic landscape of Eurasia not because of any single person's reproductive success, but because it created new possibilities for human movement and interaction. This perspective shifts our focus from searching for genetic emperors to understanding how political and economic systems shape biological outcomes. It's a more complex story, but also a more accurate one. And ultimately, it may be more important for understanding how genetic patterns emerge and persist in human populations. The myth of Genghis Khan's genetic empire will probably persist because it satisfies deep human needs for narrative coherence and ancestral significance. But the real genetic legacy of the Mongol period lies in something more profound: the demonstration that human biology and human history are inextricably intertwined, and that the movement of people across landscapes can have consequences that persist for centuries in ways we're only beginning to understand. But let's pause here for a moment, because there's something we need to address, something that cuts to the heart of why this story matters beyond academic curiosity or genetic genealogy websites. We're living through an era where DNA testing has become as common as checking the weather, where millions of people spit into tubes hoping to discover they're descended from Vikings or royalty or famous conquerors. And in that marketplace of ancestral dreams, the Genghis Khan story has become a bestseller. Walk into any conversation about genetic ancestry today, and you'll likely hear someone mention the statistic: 1 in 200 men might be descended from Genghis Khan. It's become a cultural meme, a dinner party factoid, a way to make medieval history feel personally relevant. But this popularization has created a feedback loop where the scientific uncertainty gets lost in the storytelling. The problem isn't that people are interested in their ancestry. The problem is that we've created a system where complex statistical correlations get transformed into simple narratives of descent and inheritance, where probability becomes proof, and where the messy reality of population genetics gets packaged into clean stories about genetic emperors and their modern descendants. This transformation reveals something deeper about how we process scientific information in the modern world. We want our data to tell stories, preferably stories that make us feel special or connected to something larger than ourselves. But genetics, like most sciences, doesn't naturally produce the kind of narratives that satisfy human psychological needs. Real genetic inheritance is probabilistic, fragmentary, and often invisible to the methods we use to detect it. It operates through mechanisms like genetic drift, population bottlenecks, and admixture events that don't map neatly onto the stories we tell about heroes and empires. The actual process of how genes move through populations over time is far more chaotic and contingent than our desire for clean lineages would suggest. Consider what happens when you try to trace any genetic lineage backward through time. Each generation, the number of your potential ancestors doubles. 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. By the time you reach the 13th century, you theoretically have millions of potential ancestral slots. But here's the paradox. There weren't millions of separate people alive then who could fill those slots. This creates what geneticists call pedigree collapse. As you go back in time, your theoretical family tree starts to fold in on itself as the same individuals appear in multiple positions. Your ancestors start marrying their own distant cousins, not by choice, but by mathematical necessity. In a world with limited population sizes and restricted mobility, everyone becomes related to everyone else relatively quickly. This means that if Genghis Khan has any living descendants at all, he's probably an ancestor of a substantial portion of the world's population, not just people who carry a particular Y chromosome marker. But this kind of universal ancestry doesn't make for compelling headlines or profitable genetic testing packages. The focus on patrilineal descent through Y chromosomes reflects cultural biases about how inheritance and identity work, not biological realities about how genes actually move through populations. Your genetic inheritance comes from thousands of ancestors, not just the unbroken chain of fathers passing chromosomes to sons. Most of your genetic material has nothing to do with your surname or your paternal lineage, yet we continue to privilege these narrow slices of inheritance because they seem to offer clear stories about descent and connection. Y chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA don't recombine the way other parts of the genome do, so they can preserve information about deep ancestry that other genetic markers lose over time. But this preservation comes at a cost. They represent tiny fractions of your total genetic inheritance. This is why the search for genetic proof of famous ancestry is often more about psychology than biology. We want to believe that our genes connect us to historical figures because it makes our own existence feel more meaningful, more rooted in significance. But the actual mechanisms of genetic inheritance work through processes that are far more egalitarian and chaotic than our ancestral fantasies suggest. The Mongol genetic legacy story also reveals how scientific research gets transformed as it moves from academic journals into popular culture. The original 2003 study by Zerjal and colleagues was careful to hedge its claims about Genghis Khan. The authors proposed him as a possible source for the Y chromosome cluster they identified, but they emphasized that this was speculative and that other explanations were equally plausible. But speculation has a way of hardening into fact as information travels through different media environments. Science journalists, working under deadline pressure and audience expectations, often strip away the uncertainties and caveats that define actual scientific work. Headlines need to be clear and compelling, not probabilistic and conditional. The transformation continues as the story moves from journalism into documentary films, educational materials, and casual conversation. Each retelling tends to make the claims more definitive, the connections more certain, What began as a tentative hypothesis about possible genetic correlation becomes established fact about proven descent. This process isn't unique to genetics or historical research. It happens across scientific fields whenever complex findings encounter the simplifying pressures of public communication. But it's particularly problematic in genetics because genetic data seems so authoritative, so objective. Numbers and percentages carry a weight of certainty that can obscure the uncertainties and assumptions built into their interpretation. The result is a public understanding of genetic ancestry that often bears little resemblance to what the actual science can demonstrate. People expect genetic testing to reveal clear ancestral connections and definitive historical lineages, but what they actually get are statistical correlations and probability estimates that require careful interpretation. This gap between expectation and reality has created a thriving industry of genetic ancestry testing that promises more than it can deliver. Companies market their services using language about discovering your true ancestry or unlocking your genetic history, but what they're actually providing are statistical analyses of genetic similarity patterns in their reference databases. The broader implications of this story extend beyond genetics into how we think about identity, ancestry, and belonging in the modern world. The appeal of genetic ancestry testing reflects deep human needs for connection and rootedness that aren't necessarily satisfied by the mobile, globalised societies most of us inhabit today. In a world where traditional forms of community and identity have been disrupted by urbanisation, migration, and cultural change, genetic ancestry offers the promise of connection to something permanent and authentic. It suggests that beneath the surface chaos of modern life, there are deep biological continuities that link us to specific places and peoples, but this promise comes with complications. Genetic ancestry testing often reinforces essentialist ideas about identity that don't match the complex realities of how human cultures and societies actually work. It suggests that genetic similarity translates directly into cultural affinity or shared identity, when the relationship between biology and culture is far more complex and contingent. The focus on finding famous ancestors in genetic data also reflects broader cultural anxieties about significance and meaning. In societies where traditional sources of status and identity have been weakened, the possibility of genetic connection to historical figures offers a new form of distinction and specialness. But this search for genetic nobility often misses the more profound truth about human ancestry. We are all descended from survivors, from people who managed to navigate the challenges of their times well enough to pass their genes forward to the present. The vast majority of our ancestors were ordinary people whose names were never recorded, but whose biological legacy is just as real as any emperor's. The Genghis Khan genetic myth ultimately says more about our contemporary needs and anxieties than it does about medieval genetics or imperial legacy. It reveals our hunger for connection to historical significance, our faith in scientific authority, and our tendency to transform complex data into simple stories that satisfy psychological rather than analytical needs. This brings us to a crucial question about how we should interpret genetic data in historical contexts. If we can't definitively connect modern genetic patterns to specific historical figures, what can genetics actually tell us about the past? And how should we balance scientific humility with public curiosity about ancestral connections? The answer, like most things in science, is more nuanced than either genetic ancestry marketing or skeptical dismissal would suggest. Genetics can provide valuable insights into historical processes, but those insights are probabilistic rather than definitive, and they work best when integrated with other forms of historical evidence rather than treated as standalone proof. Population genetics can reveal patterns of migration, mixture, and demographic change that complement what we learn from archaeological and textual sources. It can help us understand how human populations have moved and interacted over time, even when we lack detailed historical records of those processes. But genetic data works best for understanding general patterns rather than specific events or individuals. It can tell us that populations mix during certain time periods, but it usually can't tell us exactly when, where, or how that mixing occurred. It can reveal that certain lineages expanded rapidly, but it often can't explain why or connect those expansions to specific historical causes. This is why the most productive genetic research on historical questions tends to focus on processes rather than personalities, on understanding how demographic changes occurred, rather than identifying specific individuals who caused them. The Mongol period provides an excellent case study for this approach because it represents a time of unprecedented human mobility and cultural exchange. Rather than asking whether we can find Genghis Khan's genetic signature in modern populations, we might ask how the political and economic systems of the Mongol Empire affected patterns of human movement and interaction. Rather than searching for genetic proof of conquest, we might investigate how imperial infrastructure facilitated demographic mixing across previously separated regions. These questions are more complex but also more historically meaningful than the search for genetic emperors. They acknowledge that genetic change happens through the accumulated actions of many people rather than the exceptional reproduction of single individuals. They recognize that the most profound biological legacies often come from systematic changes in how societies organize movement and interaction rather than from dramatic conquest events. This perspective also helps us understand why the Mongol genetic legacy has been so difficult to pin down despite decades of research and increasingly sophisticated analytical methods. The empire's biological impact may have been too diffuse and systematic to show up clearly in the kind of genetic data we typically collect. Most genetic studies of historical questions rely on comparing modern populations to infer past demographic events. But this approach works best for detecting dramatic, localized changes, like founder effects or population replacements. It's less effective at identifying gradual systematic changes in mobility and interaction patterns that affect entire regions over extended time periods. The Mongol Empire's approach to governance and administration created exactly these kinds of systematic changes. Rather than replacing local populations with Mongol settlers, the empire typically incorporated existing communities into broader networks of exchange and administration. Rather than imposing genetic uniformity, it facilitated genetic mixing through increased mobility and interaction. These changes would have had biological consequences, but they might not show up clearly in analyses that focus on identifying specific lineages or dramatic demographic shifts. The genetic legacy might be visible only in subtle changes to patterns of genetic diversity and population structure that require very large sample sizes and sophisticated statistical methods to detect. Recent advances in ancient DNA technology offer new possibilities for investigating these questions more directly. As researchers develop methods for extracting genetic material from archaeological remains, we may eventually be able to compare pre-Mongol and post-Mongol populations directly, rather than inferring past changes from modern genetic patterns. But even these technological advances won't necessarily provide the kind of definitive answers that public curiosity demands. Ancient DNA is fragmentary and often degraded, limiting the kinds of analyses that are possible. Sample sizes are typically small, making it difficult to draw broad conclusions about population-level changes. And the preservation of organic material depends on environmental conditions that vary dramatically across the vast territories once controlled by the Mongol Empire. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Mongol genetic legacy story is about the need for intellectual humility when interpreting scientific data in historical contexts. The desire to connect genetic patterns to specific historical figures or events is understandable, but it often leads us to overinterpret correlations as causations and to mistake statistical possibilities for proven facts. Real science works through the gradual accumulation of evidence from multiple sources, not through dramatic revelations that definitively resolve complex questions. The most reliable insights come from patterns that appear consistently across different types of data and analytical approaches, not from single studies that make extraordinary claims. In the case of Mongol genetic legacy, the most robust finding is probably the simplest. The empire facilitated human movement and interaction on an unprecedented scale, and this increased connectivity had biological as well as cultural consequences. The specific genetic signatures of these changes may remain elusive, but the general pattern is supported by historical, archaeological, and genetic evidence. This conclusion may be less exciting than stories about genetic emperors and their millions of descendants, but it's more scientifically defensible and historically meaningful. It acknowledges the complexity of how genetic and cultural change actually occur while recognizing the real impact that political systems can have on human biology. It also points toward more productive ways of thinking about the relationship between genetics and history. Rather than searching for genetic proof of specific historical narratives, we might use genetic data to investigate broader questions about how human populations have responded to changing political, economic, and environmental conditions over time. These questions don't offer the simple answers or personal connections that drive much public interest in genetic ancestry, but they provide more reliable insights into the complex processes that have shaped human diversity and distribution across the globe. They remind us that our genetic inheritance comes not from individual heroes or conquerors, but from the accumulated choices and movements of countless ordinary people responding to the opportunities and constraints of their times. The empire that may have changed our genes wasn't built by a single man's reproductive success, but by systems and institutions that made new forms of human connection possible. That's a more complex legacy, but also a more enduring one. And in the end, it may be the more important story to tell. So where does this leave us with the question of genetic empires? If we can't point to a test tube and say definitively, here lies the DNA of Genghis Khan, and if the statistical correlations that once seemed so compelling have grown murky under closer scrutiny, what exactly are we left with? Perhaps something more honest, more complex, and ultimately more fascinating than any single founder story could ever be? The reality is that the Mongol Empire did change the genetic landscape of Eurasia, just not in the way that early headlines suggested. Rather than leaving behind the genetic signature of one supremely successful patriarch, it created conditions for something far more systematic: the mixing of human populations on a scale that had never been attempted before and hasn't been matched since. Consider the logistics alone. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol communication system known as the Yam stretched across thousands of kilometers, connecting Beijing to Baghdad through a network of relay stations, supply posts, and administrative centers. This wasn't just a postal service, it was a circulatory system for human movement. Messengers, merchants, diplomats, and administrators traveled these routes regularly, carrying not just information and goods, but genetic material from one end of the known world to the other. The scale of this movement becomes clearer when you examine the empire's administrative practices. Unlike conquest states that simply imposed new rulers on existing populations, the Mongols systematically relocated skilled specialists across their territories. Chinese engineers were transported to Central Asia to build siege engines. Persian administrators were appointed to govern Russian principalities. Islamic scholars were brought to Mongolia to establish educational institutions. These weren't temporary assignments, but permanent relocations that often included entire families and support communities. A metal worker moved from Damascus to Karakoram didn't just bring his technical skills. He brought his genes, his marriage prospects, and his potential descendants. Multiply this by thousands of such relocations across a century of imperial expansion, and you begin to see how genetic mixing could occur without any single lineage dominating the process. The empire's approach to military organization amplified these mixing effects. Rather than maintaining ethnically homogeneous Mongol units, imperial armies incorporated soldiers from conquered territories into integrated formations. These mixed military units campaigned together for months or years, established bonds that extended beyond battlefield cooperation, and often settled together in garrison towns or frontier regions. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of systematic integration. Burial sites from the Mongol period across Eurasia show combinations of cultural practices that reflect the mixing of different traditions. Pottery styles blend techniques from distant regions. Tool designs incorporate elements from multiple cultural backgrounds. These aren't just trade goods, but evidence of communities where people from different origins were living, working, and presumably intermarrying. But perhaps the most significant factor in genetic mixing was the empire's economic infrastructure. The Mongol period witnessed an unprecedented expansion of trade networks that connected regions which had previously had minimal contact. The famous Silk Road reached its medieval peak during this era, but the biological significance lay not in the luxury goods being transported, but in the people doing the transporting. Caravan trade required extensive support networks, guides who knew local terrain, translators who could navigate linguistic boundaries, suppliers who could provide food and equipment, and local agents who could facilitate transactions in distant markets. These networks created permanent communities of people with diverse geographic origins who interacted regularly and established families together. Trading posts evolved into cosmopolitan settlements where genetic mixing occurred naturally through the ordinary processes of courtship, marriage, and child rearing. Seasonal markets became annual gatherings that brought together people from vast distances who might otherwise never have met. The mundane logistics of commerce created opportunities for genetic exchange that no amount of conquest alone could have achieved. The empire's religious tolerance also facilitated genetic mixing in unexpected ways. Unlike many conquest states that imposed uniform belief systems, Mongol administrators actively recruited specialists from different religious traditions to work in the same institutions. Buddhist monasteries, Islamic madrasas, Christian schools, and traditional shamanistic centers all operated under imperial protection, often in the same cities. This religious pluralism created social environments where people from vastly different backgrounds collaborated on everything from legal administration to scientific research. These weren't just professional relationships, but social networks that often led to personal connections across cultural boundaries. When a Nestorian Christian scribe worked alongside a Buddhist astronomer in a Mongol administrative centre, their children might inherit genetic material from traditions that had previously been separated by thousands of kilometres. Modern genetic analysis has begun to reveal the biological consequences of this systematic mixing, though the patterns are more complex than early researchers anticipated. Rather than finding dramatic founder effects or simple replacement signals, scientists are discovering mosaic patterns of genetic admixture that reflect the empire's role as a facilitator of human movement, rather than a genetic conquest machine. Studies of autosomal DNA across Central Asia show exactly what you might expect from a period of increased connectivity. Populations with more diverse ancestral components than would be predicted from geographic location alone. People living in what is now Kazakhstan carry genetic signatures from East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Communities in Mongolia show influences from South Asian and Siberian populations. These patterns don't reflect ancient migrations, but relatively recent admixture events that correlate with periods of imperial integration. The timing of these genetic mixing events provides some of the strongest evidence for the empire's biological impact. Molecular clock estimates for various admixture components across Eurasia consistently point to mixture events occurring between the 12th and 14th centuries, precisely when Mongol political systems were facilitating unprecedented human mobility. But these genetic signatures don't follow the simple conquest narratives that dominated early research. Instead of showing unidirectional gene flow from Mongolia outward, the data reveal multi-directional mixing that reflects the complex realities of imperial administration and economic integration. Chinese genetic components appear in Iran, Persian signatures show up in eastern Mongolia, Turkic and Indo-European elements are distributed throughout the steppe regions. This pattern makes perfect sense when you consider how the empire actually functioned. Rather than being a Mongol empire imposed on conquered peoples, it was an integrated system where different populations contributed specialized skills and knowledge to shared administrative and economic goals. The genetic mixing reflects this functional integration rather than simple demographic replacement. Perhaps most intriguingly, these mixing patterns don't correlate neatly with political boundaries or military campaigns. Instead, they follow trade routes, administrative centres, and zones of sustained cultural interaction. This suggests that the empire's genetic legacy came primarily from the systems of movement and exchange that imperial infrastructure made possible, not from conquest events themselves. The implications extend beyond simple historical curiosity. What we're seeing in the genetic record is evidence of how political systems can reshape human biology through systematic changes in mobility patterns and social organisation. The Mongol Empire created conditions that allowed people to move and mix in ways that had been impossible for centuries, and those changes left biological signatures that persist today. This perspective helps explain why the search for a single Genghis Khan gene was probably misguided from the beginning. Real genetic change happens not through the exceptional reproductive success of individual rulers, but through systematic changes in how populations interact and integrate over time. The empire's biological legacy lies not in any single lineage, but in the complex web of genetic relationships it made possible. This brings us to one of the most important lessons from the Mongol genetic legacy story: the danger of imposing modern assumptions about identity and inheritance onto historical genetic data. The early focus on patrilineal descent through Y chromosomes reflected contemporary cultural biases about how genetic legacy works, not biological realities about how genes actually move through populations. In reality, genetic inheritance is far more egalitarian and chaotic than our narratives about genetic emperors suggest. Every person carries genetic material from thousands of ancestors, not just the unbroken chain of fathers or mothers that can be traced through non-recombining chromosomes. Most genetic inheritance has nothing to do with surnames, royal lineages, or famous historical figures. The focus on Y chromosome lineages also reflects a broader tendency to privilege male reproductive success in discussions of genetic legacy. But the biological reality is that genetic mixing occurs through both maternal and paternal lineages, and the most significant demographic changes often involve the movement and integration of entire communities rather than the exceptional fertility of individual males. This gender bias in genetic ancestry research has broader implications for how we interpret historical demographic patterns. Stories about genetic conquest typically emphasize male military success and reproductive dominance, but the actual processes of population mixing often involve more complex social dynamics, including voluntary migration, intermarriage between communities, and the integration of families rather than individuals. The Mongol case illustrates these complexities clearly. While the empire was certainly male-dominated in its military and political leadership, its biological impact came primarily from systematic changes in how entire communities moved and interacted. Women as well as men participated in these demographic movements, and genetic mixing occurred through ordinary social processes rather than extraordinary reproductive events. Modern genetic research is beginning to incorporate these insights by focusing more on autosomal DNA patterns that reflect the full spectrum of genetic inheritance rather than just patrilineal or matrilineal lineages. This approach provides a more complete picture of how populations have mixed and changed over time, though it also produces more complex results that are harder to package into simple narratives about genetic legacy. The shift toward more comprehensive genetic analysis has revealed that most human populations show evidence of recent admixture from multiple sources. Rather than being the exception, genetic mixing appears to be the norm for human populations, especially in regions that have served as corridors for trade, migration, or political integration. This normalization of genetic mixing has important implications for how we think about ancestry and identity in the modern world. Rather than being unusual or noteworthy, having ancestors from multiple geographic regions appears to be typical for most human populations. The genetic diversity that ancestry testing companies market as exotic or special is actually a common feature of human inheritance patterns. The Mongol genetic legacy story also illustrates the limitations of current genetic methods for historical reconstruction. Despite decades of research and increasingly sophisticated analytical techniques, we still cannot definitively connect modern genetic patterns to specific historical individuals or events. The resolution of genetic data simply isn't fine enough to support the kind of precise historical claims that public interest demands. This methodological limitation is important to acknowledge because it affects how we should interpret genetic ancestry information more generally. The statistical correlations that ancestry testing companies present as evidence of specific ancestral connections are often based on similar analytical approaches that have proven inadequate for resolving historical questions about known figures like Genghis Khan. If we cannot genetically verify connections to one of the most famous figures in medieval history, despite having extensive historical records and large genetic datasets from relevant populations, what does that say about claims to identify more obscure ancestral connections based on smaller datasets and less historical context? The answer suggests that genetic ancestry testing, while scientifically valid as a tool for analysing population structure and genetic similarity, may not be able to deliver the specific historical insights that drive much public interest in these services. The gap between what the technology can demonstrate and what people want to learn about their ancestry remains substantial. This doesn't mean genetic ancestry research is worthless, but it does suggest the need for more realistic expectations about what genetic data can and cannot tell us about individual family histories. Population-level patterns are much more reliable than individual-level inferences, especially when dealing with time depths beyond a few generations. The broader cultural implications of the Mongol genetic myth extend beyond genetics into questions about how we construct identity and meaning in the modern world. The appeal of genetic ancestry testing reflects deeper anxieties about belonging and significance that aren't necessarily addressed by biological data, no matter how sophisticated. In increasingly mobile and globalized societies, traditional sources of identity and community have been disrupted in ways that create psychological needs for connection and rootedness. Genetic ancestry offers the promise of biological connections that transcend the contingencies of modern social life, suggesting that beneath surface differences lie deeper biological continuities. But this promise often comes with problematic assumptions about the relationship between genetic similarity and cultural affinity. The idea that sharing genetic markers with people from specific geographic regions creates meaningful connections to those places or cultures reflects essentialist thinking that doesn't match the complex realities of how identity and belonging actually work. Cultural identity is learned rather than inherited, transmitted through social processes rather than genetic ones. People can develop deep connections to places and traditions that have no relationship to their biological ancestry, just as they can feel alienated from cultures that are supposedly encoded in their genes. The search for genetic connections to famous historical figures also reflects broader cultural anxieties about significance and achievement. In societies where traditional forms of status and recognition have been weakened, the possibility of genetic connection to historically important people offers a new form of distinction and specialness. But this search for genetic nobility often misses more profound truths about human ancestry and achievement. Every person alive today is descended from an unbroken line of survivors who managed to navigate the challenges of their time successfully enough to pass their genes forward to the present. This universal heritage of survival and adaptation is far more remarkable than any connection to famous individuals. The ancestors who actually matter for understanding who we are today are not the famous figures whose names appear in history books, but the countless ordinary people whose daily choices and struggles created the conditions for our existence. Their genetic legacy is just as real as any emperor's, and their contributions to our inheritance are far more substantial. This perspective suggests a different way of thinking about genetic ancestry that emphasizes shared humanity rather than special connections to elite historical figures. Instead of searching for genetic proof of descent from conquerors or royalty, we might appreciate the more fundamental truth that all humans share recent common ancestry and carry genetic material from diverse populations across the globe. The time depths involved in human genetic inheritance mean that most people alive today share ancestors from multiple continents within the last few thousand years. Rather than being divided into distinct genetic populations that correspond to modern national or ethnic boundaries, humanity forms a continuous network of relationships that reflects thousands of years of movement, mixture, and shared ancestry. This biological unity doesn't erase cultural differences or historical experiences, but it does provide a foundation for thinking about human diversity in more inclusive and egalitarian terms. The genetic evidence suggests that differences between human populations are generally smaller and more recent than cultural narratives about ancestry and identity often assume. The Mongol genetic legacy story ultimately serves as a case study in how scientific data gets interpreted through cultural lenses that may not align with biological realities. The search for genetic emperors and their descendants reflects modern assumptions about inheritance and identity that may be more about contemporary psychological needs than historical accuracy. Real genetic inheritance is messier, more egalitarian, and more complex than the stories we tell about it. It operates through mechanisms that don't respect the boundaries we draw between populations, nations, or historical periods. It connects us to ancestors we'll never know and places we'll never visit, but it also reminds us that human diversity emerges from shared rather than separate origins. The empire that changed our genes wasn't built by any single individual's reproductive success, but by systems and institutions that made new forms of human connection possible across unprecedented distances and cultural boundaries. That's a more complex legacy than genetic founder effects, but it's also a more accurate reflection of how genetic and cultural change actually occur in human populations. Understanding this complexity doesn't diminish the historical significance of the Mongol Empire or the scientific value of genetic ancestry research, but it does suggest a need for more nuanced approaches to interpreting genetic data in historical contexts, approaches that acknowledge both the possibilities and limitations of what genetic analysis can tell us about the past. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol genetic legacy story reminds us that the most profound changes in human history often occur through systematic transformation of social and economic conditions, rather than through the exceptional actions of individual leaders. The biological impact of the Mongol Empire came not from conquest alone, but from the creation of infrastructure and institutions that facilitated human movement and interaction on an unprecedented scale. This perspective has implications for how we think about other historical questions where genetic data might provide insights into past demographic processes. Rather than focusing on identifying the genetic signatures of specific individuals or dramatic events, we might ask how different political and economic systems affected patterns of human movement and population mixing over time. These questions are more complex but potentially more illuminating than searches for genetic proof of particular historical narratives. They acknowledge that genetic change happens through the accumulated effects of many people's choices and movements, rather than through exceptional reproductive events. They recognize that the most lasting biological legacies often come from systematic changes in how societies organize themselves, rather than from the actions of individual heroes or conquerors. The Mongol case provides an excellent example of this approach because it represents a clear instance where political and economic changes created new possibilities for human interaction across vast geographic distances. The genetic consequences of these changes may be difficult to measure precisely, but their general pattern is supported by multiple lines of evidence from genetics, archaeology, and historical records. This convergence of different types of evidence provides more reliable insights than any single genetic study could offer, especially when dealing with complex historical questions that involve multiple populations and extended time periods. The most robust scientific conclusions typically emerge from patterns that appear consistently across different methodological approaches rather than from single dramatic findings. In the case of Mongol genetic legacy, the most defensible conclusion is probably the most general one. The empire facilitated human movement and interaction on an unprecedented scale, and this increased connectivity had biological as well as cultural consequences that persist in measurable ways today. This conclusion may be less exciting than stories about genetic emperors and their millions of descendants, but it's more scientifically reliable and historically meaningful. It acknowledges the complexity of how genetic and cultural change actually occur, while recognizing the real impact that political systems can have on human biology over extended time periods. It also points toward more productive ways of using genetic data to investigate historical questions. Rather than searching for genetic proof of specific narratives about individual figures, we might focus on understanding broader patterns of demographic change and their relationship to documented historical processes. These approaches require more sophisticated analytical methods and larger datasets than searches for simple founder effects, but they also offer more reliable insights into the complex relationships between human biology and human history. They remind us that genetic inheritance reflects the accumulated choices and movements of countless individuals rather than the exceptional success of single ancestors. The empire that changed our genes was ultimately built not by genetic conquest, but by the creation of systems that made new forms of human connection possible. That's a more complex story than genetic founder myths, but it's also a more accurate and ultimately more important one for understanding how human diversity emerges and persists across space and time. This brings us to perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this entire genetic puzzle. What happens when the empire you're searching for was designed from the very beginning to leave no trace? Because unlike the stone monuments of Egypt or the marble columns of Rome, the Mongol Empire was built on a principle that directly contradicts our modern obsession with permanent legacy. It was an empire of intentional invisibility. Think about what this means for genetic detective work. We're trying to solve a mystery where the primary suspect may have deliberately destroyed all the evidence. Genghis Khan's burial site remains one of archaeology's greatest unsolved puzzles, not because it was lost to time, but because it was hidden by design. According to historical accounts, the funeral procession killed everyone they encountered to keep the location secret. The soldiers who dug the grave were executed. Even the executioners were killed by a final team sworn to silence. This wasn't paranoia, it was policy. In Mongol tradition, disturbing a great leader's resting place could unleash spiritual chaos that would destabilize the entire empire, so they made the grave disappear completely. No marker, no monument, no way for future generations to find the man whose genetic legacy we're now desperately trying to trace. But here's the deeper irony. This same culture of mobility and impermanence that makes Genghis Khan impossible to find may also explain why the genetic evidence is so frustratingly ambiguous. The Mongol Empire wasn't built to create permanent genetic monuments any more than it was built to create permanent stone ones. It was designed to move, to adapt, to absorb, and integrate rather than replace and dominate. Consider how this affected even the imperial family structure. Unlike European monarchies that's obsessed over bloodline purity and dynastic succession, Mongol leadership was more fluid. Adoption was common. Marriage alliances brought outsiders into the ruling clan. Merit could elevate people from conquered populations to positions of authority within a single generation. This flexibility extended to reproduction itself. While Genghis Khan certainly had multiple wives and concubines, as was typical for steppe leaders, the empire's approach to lineage was more pragmatic than romantic. Sons were judged by their competence rather than their birth order. Daughters were married strategically to cement alliances across vast distances. The imperial family tree was intentionally tangled with political rather than purely genetic logic. What this means for modern genetic analysis is profound. We're not just looking for the descendants of one man, but for the biological traces of an entire political system that prioritized integration over purity. The genetic signature we should expect isn't a clean patrilineal line, but a complex web of relationships that reflects the empire's approach to absorbing and incorporating diverse populations. Recent computational modelling has begun to explore what this kind of systematic genetic mixing would look like over time. Rather than producing the star-shaped phylogenies that early researchers expected from single-founder effects, integrated political systems tend to create more diffuse patterns of genetic admixture that are harder to detect, but potentially more significant in their long-term impact. This modelling suggests that the Mongol Empire's genetic legacy might be hiding in plain sight, distributed across so many lineages and mixed with so many other ancestral components that no single statistical analysis can isolate it clearly. It's not that the biological impact didn't occur, but that it occurred in ways that don't match our analytical expectations. The implications extend beyond genetics into fundamental questions about how we measure historical impact. We live in a culture obsessed with quantifiable legacy, with rankings and metrics and definitive proof. But what if the most transformative historical forces are precisely those that resist quantification? The Mongol Empire's approach to power was antithetical to monument building in every sense. They didn't construct massive buildings because they preferred mobility. They didn't establish permanent capitals because they valued adaptability. They didn't even maintain detailed written records because they trusted oral tradition and practical knowledge over bureaucratic documentation. This creates a profound methodological challenge for modern researchers. Almost every tool we use to study historical impact assumes that significant events leave permanent, measurable traces. Archaeological remains, written records, genetic founder effects, linguistic influences. But what if the most successful empires are those that integrate so completely with existing systems that their influence becomes invisible? The genetic ancestry industry has trained us to expect clear answers from DNA analysis, percentages that add up to 100, geographic regions mapped with precision, ancestral connections traced back through specific lineages. But real genetic inheritance doesn't work that way, especially when it involves political systems that prioritized mixing over replacement. What we're learning from the Mongol case is that the absence of clear genetic signals might itself be evidence of a particular kind of imperial success. An empire that changes everything while appearing to change nothing. That leaves biological traces so thoroughly integrated with existing populations that they become undetectable through standard analytical methods. This perspective requires a fundamental shift in how we think about genetic legacy. Instead of searching for genetic emperors whose DNA dominates entire regions, we might need to look for genetic diplomats whose influence appears in subtle shifts in population structure and diversity patterns that only become visible through very large-scale comparative analyses. The broader implications reach into how we understand identity and belonging in the genomic age. The search for genetic connections to famous historical figures reflects deeper anxieties about meaning and significance that DNA testing promises to resolve, but often cannot deliver. We want our genes to tell us stories about who we are and where we come from. We want biological proof of connection to something larger than ourselves. But genetics is fundamentally a science of relationships and probabilities, not identities and certainties. It can tell us about similarity patterns and population structure, but it cannot resolve questions about personal meaning or cultural belonging. The Mongol genetic myth persists precisely because it offers what we desperately want: a biological connection to historical significance. The possibility that ordinary people today might carry the genetic legacy of one of history's most transformative figures appeals to deep psychological needs that have little to do with scientific accuracy. But this desire for genetic significance often blinds us to more profound truths about human ancestry and inheritance. Every person alive today is descended from survivors, from people who navigated the challenges of their time successfully enough to pass their genes forward through hundreds of generations. This universal heritage of resilience and adaptation is far more remarkable than any connection to individual historical figures. The ancestors who actually shaped your genetic inheritance are not the famous names from history books, but the countless ordinary people whose daily choices created the conditions for your existence. Their struggles against disease, hunger, and violence, their decisions about where to migrate and whom to marry, their success in raising children who survived to reproduce. These anonymous contributions to your genetic legacy are far more substantial than any theoretical connection to medieval conquerors. This brings us to one of the most important lessons from the entire Mongol genetic legacy story: the danger of confusing correlation with causation in genetic ancestry research. Just because two people share genetic markers doesn't mean they share meaningful ancestral connections, especially when those markers are common in large populations across vast geographic regions. The Y chromosome lineage, originally attributed to Genghis Khan, appears in millions of men across Asia, but this distribution could reflect many different historical processes: population bottlenecks, founder effects, cultural practices that favour certain lineages, migration patterns that have nothing to do with conquest. Without direct biological samples from known historical individuals, connecting modern genetic patterns to specific past figures remains largely speculative. This uncertainty extends to genetic ancestry testing more generally. The algorithms that assign ancestry percentages and geographic origins rely on reference populations and statistical models that involve significant assumptions about historical demographic patterns. Small changes in these assumptions can produce dramatically different results, yet most consumers receive their genetic ancestry reports as definitive statements about their biological heritage. The reality is that genetic ancestry testing provides statistical estimates based on current knowledge and available data, not objective measurements of historical truth. These estimates can be useful for understanding broad patterns of genetic similarity, but they cannot resolve specific questions about individual family histories or connections to particular historical figures. Understanding these limitations doesn't diminish the scientific value of genetic research, but it does suggest the need for more realistic expectations about what genetic data can and cannot tell us about our personal histories. Population-level insights are much more reliable than individual-level inferences, especially when dealing with time depths beyond a few generations. The Mongol case also illustrates how scientific research gets transformed as it moves from academic journals into popular culture. The original genetic studies were careful to hedge their claims about historical connections, emphasizing that their findings were suggestive rather than definitive. But this scientific caution often gets lost in translation as research findings move through media environments that prioritize clarity and drama over uncertainty and nuance. Headlines need to be compelling, not probabilistic. Documentary films need clear narratives, not statistical ambiguity. Social media posts need shareable facts, not methodological caveats. Each stage of this communication process tends to make scientific claims more definitive and historical connections more certain than the underlying research actually supports. The result is a public understanding of genetic ancestry that often bears little resemblance to what the science can actually demonstrate. People expect DNA testing to reveal clear ancestral connections and definitive historical lineages, but what they actually receive are statistical correlations and probability estimates that require careful interpretation within broader historical and cultural contexts. This gap between expectation and reality has created a thriving industry that promises more than it can deliver. Genetic ancestry companies market their services using language about discovering your true heritage or unlocking your genetic history, but what they're actually providing are computational analyses of genetic similarity patterns in their reference databases. The difference matters because it affects how people interpret and use genetic ancestry information. Understanding your genetic data as statistical estimates based on current knowledge encourages appropriate humility about what can be concluded from DNA testing. Treating the same data as definitive proof of historical connections can lead to overconfident claims about ancestry and identity that aren't supported by the underlying science. But perhaps the most profound lesson from this entire investigation is about the nature of historical legacy itself. We began by asking whether Genghis Khan changed our genes, but we've discovered something more complex and arguably more important: that the most transformative historical forces often work through systematic changes in human behaviour and social organisation, rather than through the exceptional actions of individual leaders. The Mongol Empire's biological impact came not from conquest alone, but from the creation of infrastructure and institutions that facilitated human movement and interaction on an unprecedented scale. Roads, communication systems, legal frameworks, and economic incentives that made it possible for people from vastly different regions to encounter each other, form relationships, and establish families together. This kind of systematic transformation doesn't produce the dramatic genetic signatures that make for compelling headlines, but it may have more lasting biological consequences than any individual founder effect. It changes not just who reproduces, but how entire populations move and mix over time. It creates new possibilities for human connection that persist long after the political systems that enabled them have collapsed. Understanding historical legacy in these terms requires a different kind of analytical approach. Instead of searching for genetic proof of specific individuals or events, we need methods that can detect subtle, systematic changes in population structure and mobility patterns. Instead of focusing on dramatic founder effects, we need to investigate gradual processes of demographic integration that occur over extended time periods. These approaches are more methodologically challenging and less immediately satisfying than searches for genetic emperors, but they offer more reliable insights into how human populations actually change over time. They acknowledge that genetic inheritance reflects the accumulated choices and movements of many people, rather than the exceptional reproductive success of single ancestors. The empire that changed our genes was ultimately built not by genetic conquest, but by the creation of systems that made new forms of human connection possible. That's a more complex story than single-founder myths, but it's also more accurate and ultimately more important for understanding how human diversity emerges and persists across space and time. This perspective also helps explain why the search for Genghis Khan's genetic legacy has proven so elusive, despite decades of research and increasingly sophisticated analytical methods. We may have been looking for the wrong kind of signal in the wrong kind of data. The empire's biological impact might be too systematic and diffuse to show up clearly in analyses designed to detect dramatic founder effects or simple population replacements. Real genetic change often happens through processes that are invisible to the statistical methods we typically use to study ancestry and population history. Gradual shifts in marriage patterns, subtle changes in migration routes, slow alterations in social practices that affect who has children with whom. These processes can reshape the genetic landscape of entire regions while leaving few traces that are detectable through conventional population genetic analysis. The Mongol Empire created exactly these kinds of systematic changes. Rather than replacing local populations with Mongol colonists, it typically integrated existing communities into broader networks of administration and exchange. Rather than imposing genetic uniformity, it facilitated genetic mixing through increased mobility and cross-cultural interaction. These changes would have had profound biological consequences, but they might be visible only in very subtle shifts in patterns of genetic diversity and population structure that require enormous sample sizes and sophisticated computational methods to detect reliably. The genetic legacy might be there, but dispersed across so many lineages and mixed with so many other ancestral components that no single analysis can isolate it clearly. Recent advances in computational genetics and ancient DNA technology offer new possibilities for investigating these questions more directly. As methods improve for extracting genetic material from archaeological remains, we may eventually be able to compare pre-Mongol and post-Mongol populations directly, rather than inferring past changes from modern genetic patterns. But even these technological advances won't necessarily provide the definitive answers that public curiosity demands. Ancient DNA is fragmentary and often degraded, limiting the kinds of analyses that are possible. Sample sizes are typically small, making it difficult to draw broad conclusions about population-level changes, and preservation depends on environmental conditions that vary dramatically across the vast territories once controlled by the Mongol Empire. What emerges from this investigation is a more nuanced understanding of how genetic legacy actually works in human populations. Real biological inheritance is messier, more egalitarian, and more complex than the stories we tell about genetic emperors and their descendants. It operates through mechanisms that don't respect the boundaries we draw between populations, nations, or historical periods. It connects us to ancestors we'll never know and places we'll never visit. But it also reminds us that human genetic diversity emerges from shared rather than separate origins. The time depths involved in human evolution mean that most people alive today share common ancestors within the last few thousand years, regardless of their current geographic location or cultural identity. This biological unity doesn't erase cultural differences or historical experiences, but it does provide a foundation for thinking about human diversity in more inclusive terms. The genetic evidence suggests that differences between human populations are generally smaller and more recent than cultural narratives about ancestry and identity often assume. The search for genetic connections to famous historical figures ultimately reflects modern anxieties about meaning and belonging that aren't necessarily resolved by biological data, no matter how sophisticated. In increasingly mobile and globalized societies, traditional sources of identity and community have been disrupted in ways that create psychological needs for connection and rootedness. Genetic ancestry testing promises to address these needs by revealing biological connections that transcend the contingencies of modern social life. But this promise often comes with problematic assumptions about the relationship between genetic similarity and cultural affinity that don't match the complex realities of how identity and belonging actually work in human societies. Cultural identity is learned rather than inherited, transmitted through social processes rather than genetic ones. People can develop deep connections to places and traditions that have no relationship to their biological ancestry, just as they can feel alienated from cultures that are supposedly encoded in their genes. The Mongol genetic legacy story ultimately serves as a case study in the gap between scientific capability and public expectation in the genomic age. We have unprecedented ability to analyze genetic data and detect population-level patterns of ancestry and admixture. But this technical sophistication hasn't eliminated the fundamental uncertainties that limit what genetic analysis can tell us about individual histories or specific historical events. The most reliable genetic insights tend to be the most general ones, patterns of migration and mixture that affected entire regions over extended time periods. The more specific the historical claim, the less reliable genetic evidence becomes, especially when dealing with questions about individual ancestors or particular demographic events. This doesn't mean genetic ancestry research is scientifically invalid, but it does suggest the need for more realistic expectations about what genetic data can and cannot demonstrate. Population genetics is a powerful tool for understanding broad patterns of human diversity and population history, but it cannot resolve specific questions about personal ancestry or historical connections that require precision beyond what current methods can reliably provide. Understanding these limitations is important not just for interpreting genetic ancestry results, but for thinking more clearly about the relationship between biology and identity in the modern world. Genetic data can inform our understanding of human diversity and population history, but it cannot determine cultural belonging or personal meaning. The search for genetic emperors reflects deeper human needs for connection and significance that genetics alone cannot satisfy. These needs are legitimate and important, but they require different kinds of answers than biological data can provide. The most meaningful connections to history and ancestry often come through cultural transmission, personal choice, and social engagement, rather than through genetic inheritance. So where does this leave us with the question that began our investigation? Did Genghis Khan change our genes? The answer, like most honest scientific conclusions, is both more complex and more humble than the question assumes. The Mongol Empire certainly changed the genetic landscape of Eurasia, but not in the dramatic, personalised way that early headlines suggested. Rather than leaving behind the genetic signature of one supremely successful patriarch, it created conditions for systematic demographic mixing that had biological consequences we're still trying to understand and measure. These consequences were real and significant, but they were also diffuse and complex. They occurred through the accumulated effects of thousands of individual choices and movements rather than through the exceptional reproductive success of any single person. They reflected systematic changes in how human populations could move and interact rather than genetic conquest by imperial decree. This kind of biological legacy is harder to detect and less immediately satisfying than stories about genetic emperors, but it may be more historically accurate and ultimately more important for understanding how human diversity actually emerges and persists over time. It reminds us that genetic inheritance reflects the ordinary choices of countless individuals rather than the extraordinary actions of famous figures. The empire that may have changed our genes was built not by biological conquest but by the creation of systems and institutions that made new forms of human connection possible across unprecedented distances and cultural boundaries. That's a more complex legacy than genetic founder effects, but it's also a more enduring and arguably more human one. In the end, the search for Genghis Khan's genetic legacy has taught us more about our own assumptions and desires than about medieval DNA. It has revealed how scientific data gets transformed by cultural needs and media pressures. It has shown us the gap between what genetic analysis can demonstrate and what public curiosity demands. Most importantly, it has reminded us that the most profound changes in human history often occur through processes that resist simple measurement or dramatic narrative. The biological legacy of the Mongol Empire lies not in any single genetic signature, but in the complex web of human relationships it made possible. Relationships that continue to shape the genetic diversity of Eurasia in ways we're still learning to detect and understand. That may not be the answer we expected when we began looking for genetic proof of empire, but it's probably the answer we need to hear about how genetic legacy actually works in human populations. Real biological inheritance is messier than our myths suggest, but it's also more egalitarian and ultimately more wonderful. We are all descended from survivors, from people who navigated the challenges of their time successfully enough to pass their genes forward through hundreds of generations. That universal heritage of resilience and adaptation is far more remarkable than any connection to individual historical figures, and it's written into every cell of every person alive today. The empire that changed our genes wasn't built by conquest alone, but by the ordinary human capacity for movement, adaptation, and connection across the vast distances and cultural differences that define our species' journey through time. Here's the thing about genetic archaeology that nobody wants to admit. Sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones that disappear before we can properly measure them. We've spent decades hunting for the biological signature of one of history's most transformative empires, and what we've found instead is something far stranger and more elusive, a genetic legacy that might be hiding not in dramatic founder effects or clear ancestral lineages, but in the quiet spaces between populations, in the statistical noise that most analyses filter out as irrelevant. Because here's what happened when researchers started looking more carefully at the genetic landscape of post-Mongol Eurasia. They didn't find genetic conquest, they found genetic conversation, populations that should have been isolated by geography and culture showing subtle but consistent signatures of admixture. Not replacement, not domination, but mixing on a scale that suggests something systematic was happening across vast distances during the 13th and 14th centuries. Consider the archaeological evidence that's emerged from Mongol period sites across Central Asia, burial practices that blend traditions from multiple regions, pottery styles that incorporate techniques from distant areas, tool designs that reflect cultural exchange rather than simple conquest. These aren't just trade goods scattered by commerce. They're evidence of communities where people from different backgrounds were living together, working together, and presumably forming families together. But here's where it gets really interesting. When geneticists started mapping these archaeological patterns onto modern population data, they found something unexpected. The genetic signatures of mixing don't follow conquest routes or military campaigns. Instead, they follow infrastructure, trade routes, administrative centres, communication networks. The biological legacy of the Mongol Empire appears to be written not in the language of war, but in the grammar of connectivity. Think about what this means for how we understand genetic change in human populations. We've been trained to look for dramatic events that leave clear signatures in DNA, founder effects, population bottlenecks, mass migrations. But what if the most significant genetic changes happen through processes that are too gradual and systematic to show up in standard analyses? The Mongol Empire created something unprecedented in human history, a continental-scale system for moving people, goods, and information across distances that had previously been insurmountable barriers. For roughly a century, a merchant could travel from Beijing to Baghdad under the protection of a single legal framework. A craftsman relocated from Damascus could establish a workshop in Karakorum with imperial support. A diplomat could carry messages between courts that spoke entirely different languages but operated under the same administrative protocols. Each of these movements represented potential genetic mixing events. Not the dramatic founder effects that early researchers hypothesized, but steady, systematic changes in who could meet whom, who could marry whom, who could have children together. Multiply these individual interactions by thousands of similar encounters across decades of imperial connectivity, and you begin to see how genetic change could occur without leaving the kind of clear signatures that population geneticists typically search for. Recent computational modelling has begun to explore what this kind of systematic mixing would look like in genetic data. Rather than producing star-shaped phylogenies that radiate from single ancestors, integrated political systems tend to create what researchers call network effects in population structure. Multiple populations become more similar to each other across multiple genetic markers, but no single lineage dominates the process. This creates a methodological challenge for genetic ancestry research. Standard analytical approaches are designed to detect dramatic changes like founder effects or population replacements. They're much less effective at identifying gradual systematic changes in population connectivity that affect entire regions over extended time periods. But there's another layer to this puzzle that makes it even more complex. The Mongol Empire wasn't just facilitating genetic mixing between existing populations, it was also creating entirely new demographic categories through its administrative and military systems. Mixed units that combined soldiers from different regions, administrative centres that brought together specialists from distant territories, trading posts that evolved into permanent settlements where people from multiple backgrounds established communities together. These new demographic entities don't fit neatly into the population categories that genetic analysis typically uses. They weren't Chinese or Persian or Mongol in any traditional sense. They were something new, imperial populations defined by function rather than origin, by participation in continental scale systems rather than by local ancestry or cultural tradition. When these imperial populations had children, those children inherited genetic material from ancestors who might never have met without imperial infrastructure to bring them together. Over time, as these mixed populations continue to intermarry and reproduce, the genetic signatures of their diverse origins would become increasingly difficult to untangle using standard analytical methods. This helps explain why the search for clear Mongol genetic signatures has proven so frustrating. We may be looking for the wrong kind of pattern in the wrong kind of data. The empire's biological legacy might be written not in the language of conquest or founder effects, but in subtle shifts in population structure that only become visible through very large-scale comparative analyses. Modern genetic studies have begun to detect these subtle patterns, though they require sophisticated statistical methods and enormous datasets to identify reliably. When researchers compare genetic diversity patterns across Eurasia, they consistently find evidence of increased connectivity during the medieval period. Populations that should be genetically distinct based on geographic distance show more similarity than would be predicted from isolation by distance models alone. The timing of this increased connectivity correlates with the Mongol period, but the patterns don't follow simple conquest narratives. Instead, they suggest systematic changes in how populations could interact across the vast distances of the Eurasian continent. Not genetic replacement, but genetic integration on a scale that had never been attempted before. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of Mongol demographic policy. Their approach to population management was fundamentally different from most conquest states. Rather than replacing local populations with imperial colonists, they typically integrated existing communities into broader administrative and economic networks. Chinese engineers weren't just conquered and enslaved. They were relocated to Central Asia to build siege engines and then often settled permanently with their families. Persian administrators weren't simply replaced by Mongol officials. They were appointed to govern territories thousands of kilometers from their origins, where they established new households and married into local communities. This systematic relocation of skilled specialists created genetic mixing opportunities that went far beyond what conquest alone could achieve. It brought together people with complementary skills and knowledge who had reason to establish long-term relationships. An engineer from China working alongside an administrator from Persia in a Mongol administrative centre weren't just colleagues. They were potential family founders whose children would inherit genetic material from traditions that had been separated by vast distances for centuries. The scale of these relocations becomes clear when you examine Mongol administrative records that have survived in Chinese and Persian sources. Thousands of families were moved across continental distances to serve imperial needs. Entire communities of craftsmen were transported from conquered cities to establish workshops in new territories. Military units were permanently stationed in regions far from their origins and encouraged to integrate with local populations. Each of these demographic movements represented potential genetic mixing events, but they were also more than that. They were systematic attempts to create new kinds of human communities that transcended traditional ethnic and cultural boundaries. The Mongol Empire wasn't just conquering existing populations, it was experimenting with new forms of social organisation that required people from different backgrounds to work together in unprecedented ways. The genetic consequences of these experiments are still being discovered by researchers using increasingly sophisticated analytical methods. Rather than finding dramatic founder effects or simple population replacements, scientists are uncovering complex patterns of admixture that reflect the empire's systematic approach to demographic integration. Studies of autosomal DNA across Central Asia consistently show what researchers call mosaic ancestry patterns. Populations carry genetic components from multiple regions that can't be explained by ancient migrations or gradual diffusion alone. The timing and geographic distribution of these admixture events point to systematic mixing during the medieval period, precisely when Mongol political systems were facilitating unprecedented human mobility. But perhaps most intriguingly, These genetic mixing patterns don't correlate with political boundaries or military conquest timelines. Instead, they follow economic networks, administrative centres, and communication routes. The biological legacy appears to be written not in the language of war, but in the grammar of infrastructure and institutional integration. This suggests that the Mongol Empire's genetic impact came primarily from the systems it created rather than from conquest events themselves. Roads, relay stations, legal frameworks, and economic incentives that made it possible for people from vastly different regions to encounter each other, form relationships, and establish families together. Understanding genetic legacy in these terms requires a fundamental shift in how we think about the relationship between political power and biological change. Rather than searching for genetic proof of conquest or domination, we need to investigate how different political and economic systems affect patterns of human movement and interaction over time. This approach is more methodologically challenging than searching for single founder effects, but it offers more reliable insights into how human populations actually change over extended time periods. It acknowledges that genetic inheritance reflects the accumulated choices and movements of many people rather than the exceptional reproductive success of individual rulers. The implications extend beyond historical genetics into fundamental questions about how we interpret biological data in cultural contexts. The early focus on identifying Genghis Khan's lineage reflected assumptions about genetic legacy that may have been fundamentally misguided from the beginning. Real genetic change in human populations happens through processes that are often invisible to the analytical methods we typically use to study ancestry and population history. Gradual shifts in marriage patterns, subtle changes in migration routes, slow alterations in social practices that affect reproductive opportunities. These processes can reshape the genetic landscape of entire regions while leaving few traces that are detectable through conventional population genetic analysis. The Mongol Empire created exactly these kinds of systematic changes, but their biological consequences may be too diffuse and integrated to show up clearly in analyses designed to detect dramatic demographic events. The genetic legacy might be there, but dispersed across so many lineages and mixed with so many other ancestral components that no single study can isolate it definitively. This doesn't mean the biological impact didn't occur. It means that impact occurred in ways that don't match our analytical expectations or cultural narratives about how genetic legacy works. Real biological inheritance is messier and more egalitarian than stories about genetic emperors suggest. Modern genetic ancestry testing has trained consumers to expect clear answers about their biological heritage, percentages that add up to 100, geographic regions mapped with precision, ancestral connections traced through specific lineages. But actual genetic inheritance doesn't work that way, especially when it involves political systems that prioritized integration over replacement. The Mongol case illustrates why genetic ancestry claims require careful interpretation within broader historical and methodological contexts. Statistical correlations between modern genetic patterns and historical events can be suggestive, but they cannot provide definitive proof of specific ancestral connections without independent verification through other forms of evidence. This methodological humility becomes even more important when we consider how genetic ancestry information gets used in contemporary discussions about identity and belonging. The appeal of genetic testing reflects legitimate human needs for connection and rootedness, but those needs aren't necessarily satisfied by biological data, no matter how sophisticated the analysis. Cultural identity is learned rather than inherited, transmitted through social processes rather than genetic ones. People can develop deep connections to places and traditions that have no relationship to their biological ancestry, just as they can feel alienated from cultures that are supposedly encoded in their genes. The search for genetic connections to famous historical figures often reflects broader anxieties about significance and meaning that aren't resolved by discovering statistical correlations in DNA data. In increasingly mobile societies where traditional sources of identity have been disrupted, genetic ancestry testing promises biological connections that transcend the contingencies of modern social life. But this promise often comes with problematic assumptions about the relationship between genetic similarity and cultural affinity. The idea that sharing genetic markers with people from specific regions creates meaningful connections to those places reflects essentialist thinking that doesn't match the complex realities of how identity and belonging actually work in human societies. Understanding genetic data as statistical estimates based on current knowledge and available samples encourages appropriate humility about what can be concluded from DNA testing. Treating the same data as definitive proof of historical connections can lead to overconfident claims about ancestry and identity that aren't supported by the underlying science. The Mongol genetic legacy story serves as a case study in these broader issues because it illustrates how scientific research gets transformed as it moves from academic journals into popular culture. The original studies were careful to hedge their claims about historical connections, but this scientific caution often gets lost as research findings move through media environments that prioritize drama over uncertainty. But perhaps the most important lesson from this entire investigation is about the nature of historical legacy itself. We began by asking whether one man's reproductive success could reshape the genetic landscape of a continent, but we've discovered something more complex and arguably more significant. The most transformative historical forces often work through systematic changes in human behaviour and social organisation, rather than through the exceptional actions of individual leaders. The Mongol Empire's biological impact came not from genetic conquest, but from the creation of infrastructure and institutions that facilitated human movement and interaction on an unprecedented scale. This kind of systematic transformation doesn't produce dramatic genetic signatures that make for compelling headlines, but it may have more lasting biological consequences than any individual founder effect. It changes not just who reproduces, but how entire populations move and interact over time. It creates new possibilities for human connection that persist long after the political systems that enabled them have collapsed. The empire that changed our genes was ultimately built, not by biological domination, but by the creation of systems that made new forms of human relationship possible across unprecedented distances and cultural boundaries. Roads, communication networks, legal frameworks, and economic incentives that allowed people from vastly different backgrounds to encounter each other and establish families together. Understanding historical legacy in these terms requires different analytical approaches than searches for genetic emperors. Instead of focusing on dramatic founder effects, we need methods that can detect subtle, systematic changes in population structure and mobility patterns that occur over extended time periods. These approaches are more methodologically challenging and less immediately satisfying than stories about genetic conquest, but they offer more reliable insights into how human populations actually change over time. They acknowledge that genetic inheritance reflects the accumulated choices and movements of countless individuals rather than the exceptional success of single ancestors. This perspective also helps explain why the search for clear genetic proof of Mongol legacy has proven so elusive, despite decades of research and increasingly sophisticated analytical methods. We may have been looking for the wrong kind of signal in the wrong kind of data. The empire's biological impact might be too systematic and diffuse to show up clearly in analyses designed to detect dramatic founder effects or simple population replacements. Real genetic change often happens through processes that are invisible to conventional population genetic methods. Recent advances in computational genetics and ancient DNA technology offer new possibilities for investigating these questions more directly. As methods improve for extracting genetic material from archaeological remains, we may eventually be able to compare pre-Mongol and post-Mongol populations directly rather than inferring past changes from modern genetic patterns. But even these technological advances won't necessarily provide the definitive answers that public curiosity demands. Ancient DNA is fragmentary and often degraded. Sample sizes are typically small. Preservation depends on environmental conditions that vary dramatically across the vast territories once controlled by the Mongol Empire. What emerges from this investigation is a more nuanced understanding of how genetic legacy actually works in human populations. Real biological inheritance is messier, more egalitarian, and more complex than the stories we tell about genetic emperors and their descendants. It operates through mechanisms that don't respect the boundaries we draw between populations, nations, or historical periods. It connects us to ancestors we'll never know and places we'll never visit, but it also reminds us that human genetic diversity emerges from shared rather than separate origins. The time depths involved in human inheritance mean that most people alive today share common ancestors within the last few thousand years, regardless of their current geographic location or cultural identity. This biological unity doesn't erase cultural differences, but it does provide a foundation for thinking about human diversity in more inclusive terms. So where does this leave us with the question that began our investigation? Did Genghis Khan change our genes? The answer is both more complex and more humble than the question assumes. The Mongol Empire certainly changed the genetic landscape of Eurasia, but not through the dramatic personalized founder effects that early researchers hypothesized. Instead, it created conditions for systematic demographic mixing that had biological consequences we're still trying to understand and measure. These consequences were real and significant, but they were also diffuse and complex. They occurred through the accumulated effects of thousands of individual choices and movements, rather than through the exceptional reproductive success of any single person. They reflected systematic changes in how human populations could move and interact, rather than genetic conquest by imperial decree. This kind of biological legacy is harder to detect and less immediately satisfying than stories about genetic emperors, but it may be more historically accurate and ultimately more important for understanding how human diversity actually emerges and persists over time. The search for Genghis Khan's genetic legacy has taught us more about our own assumptions and desires than about medieval DNA. It has revealed how scientific data gets transformed by cultural needs and media pressures. It has shown us the gap between what genetic analysis can demonstrate and what public curiosity demands. Most importantly, it has reminded us that the most profound changes in human history often occur through processes that resist simple measurement or dramatic narrative. The biological legacy of the Mongol Empire lies not in any single genetic signature, but in the complex web of human relationships it made possible. Real biological inheritance is messier than our myths suggest, but it's also more egalitarian and ultimately more wonderful. We are all descended from survivors, from people who navigated the challenges of their time successfully enough to pass their genes forward through hundreds of generations. That universal heritage of resilience and adaptation is written into every cell of every person alive today. The empire that may have changed our genes wasn't built by conquest alone, but by the ordinary human capacity for movement, adaptation, and connection across the vast distances and cultural differences that define our species' journey through time. And maybe that's the most fitting conclusion to this genetic mystery, because in trying to trace the biological legacy of an empire built on movement, we've discovered that some of the most profound changes in human history resist the very measurements we use to detect them. The Mongol Empire may have changed our genes not through conquest, but through connection. Not through domination, but through the patient work of making a world where strangers could become neighbours, where distance could be overcome by infrastructure, where the impossible journey became merely difficult. But here's where our story takes one final, unexpected turn. Because even as we've been dissecting the myth of genetic empire, something else has been happening in laboratories around the world. Something that suggests the search for Mongol DNA might have been asking the wrong question entirely. Recent studies using whole genome sequencing have begun to reveal patterns that earlier Y chromosome analyses simply couldn't detect. Not the dramatic founder effects that made headlines, but something more subtle and perhaps more significant. Evidence of what researchers are calling connectivity signatures in the genomes of Central Asian populations. Patterns of genetic diversity that suggest systematic, long-term changes in how populations interacted during the medieval period. These aren't the clean lineages that ancestry companies love to advertise. They're statistical whispers buried in the background noise of population genetics. Signatures of increased gene flow between regions that had previously been isolated by geography and culture. Changes in the mathematical relationships between populations that suggest new forms of demographic connectivity emerged sometime between the 12th and 14th centuries. The timing is suggestive, but the patterns are complex. Rather than showing unidirectional flow from Mongolia outward, the data reveal multi-directional mixing that reflects the integrated nature of the imperial system. Chinese genetic components appearing in Iran, Persian signatures showing up in Mongolia, Turkic elements distributed throughout the steppes. Not conquest, but conversation written in the language of DNA. But perhaps the most intriguing finding is what these studies reveal about genetic diversity itself. Populations across the former Mongol territories show higher levels of genetic diversity than would be predicted from their geographic locations alone. It's as if the empire didn't just move people around, it fundamentally altered the genetic potential of entire regions by bringing together lineages that had been separated for millennia. Think about what this means in practical terms. Every time a Chinese engineer married a Persian administrator in a Mongol city, their children inherited genetic combinations that wouldn't have existed without imperial infrastructure to bring their parents together. Multiply these individual mixing events by thousands of similar encounters across decades of connectivity, and you begin to see how an empire could reshape the genetic landscape without any single lineage dominating the process. This is population genetics, operating at the level of systems rather than individuals. Not the story of one man's exceptional reproductive success, but the accumulated biological consequences of political choices that prioritized integration over isolation. The genetic legacy, written not in conquest narratives, but in the mundane details of administrative policy and economic incentive. And here's the really fascinating part. These connectivity signatures don't end with the collapse of the empire. The genetic patterns established during the Mongol period appear to have persisted and even intensified over subsequent centuries, as if the initial integration created momentum that continued long after the political system that started it had fragmented. Trade routes established under Mongol rule continued to facilitate human movement, even under different political systems. Cities founded as administrative centres evolved into permanent cosmopolitan hubs where genetic mixing became a regular feature of social life. The infrastructure of connectivity, once established, took on a life of its own. This persistence helps explain one of the puzzles that has long bothered historians. Why didn't the Mongol Empire's collapse lead to immediate refragmentation of the regions it had connected? Why did trade networks, cultural exchanges, and even political alliances continue to operate across vast distances long after centralized imperial authority had disappeared. The genetic data suggest an answer, because the biological connections established during the imperial period created human networks that transcended political boundaries. People had relatives, trading partners, and cultural connections that spanned continents. These relationships provided incentives for continued interaction that persisted regardless of changing political circumstances. In other words, the empire may have succeeded in creating exactly what it intended, a form of connectivity that was self-sustaining rather than dependent on imperial enforcement. Not genetic conquest, but genetic integration on a scale that made permanent isolation impossible. This interpretation transforms how we think about the relationship between political power and biological change. Rather than asking whether individual rulers left genetic legacies, we might ask how different political systems affect the long-term structure of human relationships. How do empires change not just who rules, but who can meet whom, who can marry whom, who can pass their genes to future generations? The Mongol case suggests that the most lasting biological legacies come not from the exceptional fertility of leaders, but from systematic changes in the opportunities available to ordinary people, infrastructure that makes movement possible, legal systems that protect travellers, economic incentives that reward cultural exchange. These systemic factors may have more profound genetic consequences than any individual founder effect. But there's another layer to this story that brings us back to the fundamental questions about identity and meaning that drive so much interest in genetic ancestry. Because even if we can demonstrate that the Mongol Empire had systematic biological consequences, what does that actually mean for people living today? If you're someone whose genetic profile shows Central Asian ancestry, does that connect you meaningfully to the medieval Mongol world? If computer models suggest your lineage was affected by imperial demographic policies, does that make you more Mongol, or Chinese, or Persian? And if the mixing was so systematic and multidirectional, what would it even mean to claim genetic descent from any particular group? These questions don't have simple answers because they're asking genetics to do something it fundamentally cannot do: transform statistical correlations into personal meaning. Genetic data can tell us about population-level patterns of similarity and difference, but it cannot resolve questions about identity, belonging, or cultural inheritance. The appeal of genetic ancestry testing reflects deeper human needs that aren't satisfied by discovering percentages or geographic regions in your DNA profile. We want to feel connected to something larger than ourselves. We want our existence to feel rooted in history and meaning. We want biological proof that we belong somewhere, that our lives have significance beyond the immediate circumstances of our birth. But genetics, for all its technical sophistication, is ultimately a science of relationships and probabilities, not identities and certainties. It can reveal that you share genetic material with people from specific regions, but it cannot tell you what those connections mean or how you should interpret them in the context of your own life. This limitation becomes especially important when we consider how genetic ancestry information gets used in contemporary discussions about race, ethnicity, and national identity. The search for genetic proof of historical connections often reflects and reinforces essentialist ideas about identity that don't match the complex realities of how human cultures actually work. The Mongol genetic legacy story illustrates these problems clearly. Even if we could definitively prove that certain lineages were affected by imperial demographic policies, what would that tell us about the people who carry those lineages today? Would it make them more authentically connected to medieval Central Asian culture? Would it give them special claims to Mongol identity or historical significance? The answer is probably no, because cultural identity is learned rather than inherited. It's transmitted through social processes of education, practice, and community participation. Not through genetic inheritance. People can develop deep connections to traditions and places that have no relationship to their biological ancestry, just as they can feel alienated from cultures that are supposedly encoded in their genes. Understanding this distinction is crucial for interpreting genetic ancestry data appropriately. Genetic similarity can be interesting and informative, but it doesn't determine cultural belonging or personal identity. Those are choices people make based on their values, experiences, and social relationships, not discoveries they make through DNA testing. The most meaningful connections to history and ancestry often come through engagement with cultural traditions, historical learning, and community participation, rather than through genetic inheritance. You can develop a profound appreciation for Mongol history and culture without having any biological connection to medieval Central Asia, just as genetic descent from imperial populations doesn't automatically create cultural affinity or historical understanding. This perspective suggests a different way of thinking about the relationship between genetics and history. Rather than searching for personal connections to famous figures or dramatic events, we might appreciate genetic data for what it can actually tell us. Information about the broad patterns of human movement and mixing that have created the diversity we see in modern populations. These patterns are fascinating in their own right, regardless of whether they connect to individual family histories or cultural identities. They reveal how human populations have responded to changing political, economic, and environmental conditions over time. They show us the biological consequences of historical processes like trade, migration, conquest, and cultural exchange. The Mongol Empire provides an excellent case study for these broader questions because it represents such a clear example of how political systems can affect demographic patterns. The genetic evidence, while complex and sometimes ambiguous, consistently points to increased connectivity during the imperial period. That's a significant finding, regardless of whether it can be connected to specific individuals or lineages. Understanding genetic history in these terms requires a kind of intellectual humility that doesn't always align with public expectations about DNA testing. It means accepting that genetic data is most reliable for understanding general patterns rather than specific events. It means recognizing that statistical correlations don't necessarily translate into personal meaning or cultural significance, but it also opens up space for appreciating the more profound truths that genetic research reveals about human diversity and shared ancestry. The time depths involved in human evolution mean that all people alive today are related through common ancestors who lived within the last few thousand years. The genetic differences between populations are generally smaller and more recent than cultural narratives about ancestry often suggest. This biological unity doesn't erase cultural differences or historical experiences, but it does provide a foundation for thinking about human diversity in more inclusive terms. Rather than emphasizing genetic divisions between populations, we might focus on the shared processes of movement, mixing, and adaptation that have created the patterns we see today. The Mongol genetic legacy story ultimately serves as a reminder that the most important historical changes often occur through ordinary human choices rather than extraordinary individual actions. The biological impact of the empire came not from genetic conquest, but from thousands of individual decisions to travel, trade, work, and establish families in new places under changing circumstances. These individual choices, aggregated across time and space, created systematic changes in human relationships that had lasting biological consequences. Not dramatic founder effects, but gradual shifts in who could meet who could marry who could pass their genes to future generations. Understanding history in these terms emphasizes human agency and ordinary experience rather than exceptional leadership or dramatic events. It reminds us that we are all products of countless individual choices made by people responding to the opportunities and constraints of their times. The ancestors who actually shaped our genetic inheritance are not the famous names from history books, but the countless ordinary people whose daily decisions created the conditions for our existence. Their choices about where to migrate, whom to marry, how to raise their children. Their success in navigating disease, hunger, conflict, and environmental change. Their persistence in passing their genes forward through hundreds of generations. This universal heritage of survival and adaptation is written into every cell of every person alive today, regardless of their specific ancestry or cultural background. It connects us not to individual heroes or conquerors, but to the broader human story of resilience, creativity, and connection across vast distances and cultural differences. The empire that may have changed our genes was ultimately built not by genetic domination, but by the ordinary human capacity for movement, adaptation, and relationship formation under changing circumstances. That's a more complex legacy than genetic founder myths, but it's also more inclusive and ultimately more accurate. It suggests that genetic ancestry, properly understood, is not about discovering special connections to elite historical figures, but about appreciating our participation in the broader human story of survival and adaptation. We are all descended from people who successfully navigated the challenges of their times. We all carry genetic material from diverse populations and distant places. We are all products of the same fundamental processes of movement, mixing, and cultural exchange that have characterized human history from the beginning. The search for genetic emperors reflects understandable human desires for connection and significance, but it often misses these more profound truths about ancestry and inheritance. Real genetic legacy is more egalitarian and more wonderful than any individual founder story. It connects us not to specific rulers or conquerors, but to the entire human family and its remarkable journey across time and space. So as we reach the end of our investigation into the empire that may have changed our genes, we're left not with definitive answers, but with better questions. Not genetic proof of individual legacy, but evidence of systematic transformation. Not personal connections to medieval rulers, but appreciation for the complex processes that have created human diversity. The Mongol genetic myth will probably persist because it satisfies deep psychological needs that scientific data alone cannot address. People will continue to search for famous ancestors in their DNA because genetic ancestry testing promises connections to historical significance that ordinary life sometimes seems to lack. But the real story revealed by genetic research is more complex and ultimately more meaningful than any individual founder narrative. It's a story about how human populations respond to changing circumstances over time, how political and economic systems can affect biological as well as cultural inheritance, how ordinary choices, aggregated across generations, can reshape the genetic landscape of entire continents. It's a story that reminds us that genetic inheritance is not destiny, but diversity, not proof of special status, but evidence of shared humanity, not individual legacy, but collective journey through the challenges and opportunities of existence on a planet that has never stopped changing. The empire that changed our genes, if it existed at all, was built not by conquest, but by connection. Not by genetic domination, but by the patient work of making a world where strangers could become neighbours, where distance could be overcome by infrastructure, where the impossible journey became merely difficult. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all, that the most lasting changes in human history come not from individual greatness, but from collective effort, not from genetic superiority, but from social innovation, not from conquest, but from the ordinary human capacity to adapt, connect, and build something larger than ourselves. The DNA we carry today is not a monument to individual rulers, but a living record of countless choices made by countless people who found ways to survive, thrive, and pass their genes forward through the endless complexity of human existence. That's not a myth. That's not a legend. That's just the truth, written in every cell, carried forward by every breath, as real as the wind that still blows across the steppes where this story began. And that truth, unlike the genetic empire we went looking for, is something we can all claim. Not because we're descended from conquerors, but because we're descended from survivors. And in the end, that may be the only ancestry that really matters. Thank you, bored people, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you focus, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the bored people in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? But before you go, let me leave you with one final thought. Because in the end, what we've discovered isn't really about Genghis Khan at all. It's about us, about how desperately we want our genes to tell us stories that make sense of who we are and where we belong. About how we've created an entire industry built on the promise that a cotton swab can unlock the secrets of identity and meaning. The Mongol genetic myth persists, not because the science supports it, but because we need it to be true. We need to believe that somewhere in our DNA lies proof of connection to something greater than ourselves. That we're not just random collections of genetic material tumbling through time, but heirs to empire, carriers of legendary bloodlines, descendants of people who mattered. But here's what the real science tells us, quietly and without fanfare. We are all heirs to empire, every single one of us. Not because we carry the genes of conquerors, but because we carry the genes of survivors. People who endured ice ages and plagues, famines and floods, wars and migrations. People who made the million small choices that kept their lineages alive long enough for us to exist. The empire that changed our genes wasn't built by any single ruler. It was built by the accumulated choices of countless ordinary people who found ways to connect across impossible distances, to adapt to changing circumstances, to build families and communities in the face of uncertainty. That's the real genetic legacy of the Mongol period. Not individual founder effects, but systematic transformation of how human populations could move and mix across the vast expanse of Eurasia. Roads and relay stations, legal frameworks, and administrative systems that made it possible for a merchant from Baghdad to marry an engineer from Beijing, for their children to inherit genetic combinations that wouldn't have existed without imperial infrastructure to bring their parents together. The DNA we carry today is not a monument to conquest, but a living record of connection. Every allele, every chromosome, every cell contains the accumulated choices of ancestors who found ways to survive, adapt, and build something larger than themselves. So the next time someone tries to sell you a story about genetic royalty or imperial bloodlines, remember this: you don't need famous ancestors to be remarkable. The fact that you exist at all, that an unbroken chain of genetic inheritance stretches from the first replicating molecules to your living, breathing body, is more miraculous than any connection to medieval rulers. The empire that truly changed our genes was not built by khans or kings, but by the ordinary human capacity for movement, adaptation, and connection across the vast distances and cultural differences that define our species' journey through time. And that empire, unlike all the others, will never fall. Because it lives not in monuments or myths, but in every breath you take, every heartbeat, every moment of consciousness that connects you to the endless chain of ancestors who survived so that you could be here now, listening to this story, carrying their legacy forward into whatever comes next. So stay curious, stay humble, and remember, the most profound truths about human history are often written not in the language of conquest, but in the quiet persistence of connection. The real genetic empire was built not by force, but by the patient work of being human together. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.